Hi, everyone. We are closer to get started. I see 3 persons that are still named as speakers. Could you please rename yourselves with your name and country and organization? Okay, we have a countdown and we have 33 seconds to go. Estamos en la cuenta regresiva y quedan 26 minutos para perdón, 23 segundos. Así que pueden prepararse todos. Por favor, abran sus cámaras los que son panelistas. Please, all panelists, open your cameras and the moderator. We are about to start. We have 10 seconds left. Sandra B, you go first, I believe.
Bulavanaka and warm Pacific greetings from Suva, Fiji. I'm Sandra Bernklau, the UN Women Representative for the Pacific, covering 14 Pacific Island countries here. And I'm absolutely delighted to be your moderator on this panel, which is on feminism in the context of the environmental crisis and climate emergency. I'm joined here today by some fabulous feminists who are activists and who bring a great deal of experience to this topic. Colleagues, we know absolutely the relationship between gender equality, women's empowerment, and climate change. We know that women are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. We know about the intersectional and compounding factors that impede women's participation in decision-making on climate change and climate-related policies and projects. But we also know that women bring solutions and that women's inclusion in decision-making leads to improved outcomes. And more importantly, we know that a feminist analysis to the climate crisis provides real solutions that are sustainable and equitable. We know that women and marginalized persons face higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change, with disproportionate risk to lives and livelihoods from disasters such as droughts, floods, and cyclones. And I can tell you, being based in the Pacific, we know that very intimately. Without equality in decision-making, women are excluded from the spaces where decisions about resources and responses to disasters are often made. Women and girls around the world, while at the front lines of the impacts, are also at the front lines of leading transformational change. Women, particularly grassroots and Indigenous women, are at the forefront of these fights, denouncing environmental degradation, advocating for inclusion, and fighting against the loss of livelihoods and health, challenging extractive and exploitative systems. These fights are often dangerous, particularly for women's human rights and environmental defenders. So we're here today to hear from feminist activists who have joined us to dialogue on the context of the environmental crisis and the climate emergency. The general objective of today's panel is to have the opportunity to hear from feminist voices, to make those voices heard, and to bring that expertise and dialogue onto real solutions to the environmental crisis, which we know reinforces gender inequality and discrimination. Some of the specific objectives we have today are to address the main challenges that women have in this crisis, to look at important actions, and the need to include a feminist analysis in all environmental movements, including the shift to both private and public financing away from investments that cause harm to systems to providing care and environmental solutions, and the approach to financing those systems. Also to recognize how women's innovations and expertise has transformed lives and livelihoods and has led to increased climate resilience and more equitable and sustainable solutions. On the panel today are representatives from civil society, the private sector, governance and financing mechanisms for climate change, as well as the UN. We have a fantastic panel of experienced feminists today. I'm going to briefly introduce them. Unfortunately, we've had a slight change. So unfortunately, we don't have the Minister of Culture and Decolonization of Bolivia. She was unable to join us today, but we do have a great lineup. We have Nolene Nambulevo, who is a Pacific activist, colleague, and a friend. Nolene is from Diva for Equality. She's the co-founder of Diverse Voices in Action for Equality, which is a Fijian feminist collective led by lesbian, bisexual, transmasculine, and gender non-conforming people that concentrates work in the urban poor communities, rural and remote constituencies of Fiji, and works with all women and people in the Pacific and globally. Very warm welcome to Nolene. We also have with us today Trupti Jain, who is the founder and director of Nairita Service, which is an award-winning social enterprise that addresses the critical challenges faced by urban development authorities and water management, with a focus on climate change mitigation, disaster reduction, and improved livelihoods. A very warm welcome to Trupti. We also have with us today Bridget Burns, who is the director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, WEDO. Bridget specializes in policy advocacy, research, and movement building at the intersection of gender equality, women's rights, and environmental and climate justice. Welcome, Bridget. Also with us today is Sanam Amin, who is a Bangladeshi writer, researcher, and facilitator committed to building a more equitable and just world. She has years of experience in feminist movement building and organizing, during which she served as co-convener of the Women's Rights Caucus on the Commission of the Status of Women and chair of Beijing plus Civil Society Steering Committee for Asia and the Pacific. We also have with us Bhumika Muchala, who is an advocate and scholar on global economic governance and justice in feminist economics, with a focus on fiscal and debt policies, systemic issues, and private finance. Welcome, Bhumika. We also have with us, also representing small island developing states, is Aisha Constable, who is the global advisor for FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund. Aisha is an activist and scholar, having researched and published on gender and climate change as part of her doctoral studies, linking her interests to climate adaptation, youth, and gender. She has served as a member of several regional and global youth networks, including the Caribbean Youth Environment Network. A warm welcome to all of our panelists. We're going to start right off, panelists. I'll be asking each of the panelists 2 key questions, and then we'll be opening up the floor for general discussion. Now, colleagues, we really need to keep our responses to 3 minutes, so we'll be starting right off. The first question will be to Nolene. Nolene, how can we promote the participation of women in design and implementation of risk prevention strategies, ensuring all voices are heard from a multicultural and an intersecting perspective? And what has been your experience in Fiji with this? Over to you, Nolene.
Thanks very much, Sandra, and a brilliant panel, and really great to be here. I think first off, feminists need to be really clear on what we mean by risk prevention. And that means in our action coalitions, but also any state and non-state work we're doing, including in social movements and more broadly. And I think one of the things we have to say is that if feminist work is really to transform, unequal and unjust work on all territories, whether it's the territories of bodies, social, economic, and ecological systems, then we have to work together really to urgently and justly move to break bad systems and to build and strengthen good ones, if we're moving towards viable and just futures. So being really clear on that. And then also being really clear that this means that the work on climate and ecological justice has to mean on human rights. It has to mean being able to speak and work on loss and damage, no matter who tries to stop that set of work from coming about. On mitigation, on adaptation, on access to justice for every single woman and person, on localization strategies, and also looking specifically at ecological sustainability from the smallest ecosystems through to the whole planetary ecosphere. So that's the 2 things so far. And if Fiji feminists and women human rights defenders here, you know, if when we're doing our feminist work, whether it's inside, with, or beyond the state, and far beyond any of the kind of ad hoc, slower, and maybe more palatable reforms, if we're going to be able to create these urgent moves we need, you know, the deeper, harder sets of work to do things like end patriarchy, to really challenge ourselves to stop coloniality, imperialism, white supremacy, you know, to do all these things, then what do we have to change? Well, one of the things we know, and that Bhumika and others will speak to, is we have to stop neoliberal capitalism in its tracks. So much of, you know, kind of the nonsensical free market and deregulatory tropes that we have heard and know in our work are clear to everyone now, after the COVID system. But the old system is therefore also fighting back. It's using its own institutions and the momentum built up over millennia, and also then centuries and decades of real neoliberal capitalism to protect itself from decline. So we also have to be really persistent and strong in refuting old practices that don't work, put economics back in its place, and provide support for natural systems and sustaining life. And that's what we're trying to do. But this is complex work, because you have to then also be very upfront in fighting extractive industries and fossil fueled economic activity. And that's enabled by states and non-state parties. And we have to enter some of those state spaces to bring about change, but we also have to do our work outside. So how to deal? One of the agreements we have to have is on the set of work, that we're ridding ourselves of this false notions of division between social, economic, ecological, and climate justice. And if we're all entwined in a living planet, then we're destroying ourselves if we don't do that. So for us, the work of Women Defend the Commons is becoming active defenders of the commons, no matter where you're working, in the state, beyond, if we're to survive and to thrive. Coherence in state policies then is really important, because an important global gain like the Paris Agreement as a baseline measure, not enough, but having that, and then having national and regional policies and initiatives that maybe counter this, that water down some of these international multilateral agreements. They compromise them by putting into place social, economic, and environmental policies that aren't coherent with some of these shifts forward, that don't do well on human rights, social flaw and protection, and infrastructure. So for example, one of the things in Fiji right now is that a lot of us are doing this acceleration work to both end and also to prevent gender-based violence in all its forms, including attempted control of women's and non-heteronormative bodies. But then these oppressive qualities of many of the religious, nationalist, traditionalist, and civil and political systems have to be tackled. They have to be seen as they really are, as the instruments of patriarchy that stop some of this progressive work to protect both ourselves as people and to protect the living planet. So if in Fiji we have a national action plan now, finally, after 40 years of work to prevent violence against women, and if we also have these new climate change policies that do have some of these protections and these mentions in text, at least, and somewhat in implementation. Those are important sets of national work, but they can be better and deeper, and they can be better by doing the work on water and sanitation and housing as climate readiness programs, adding the solid work to transform paid and unpaid work, protecting and defending the defenders, fighting for debt justice, not accepting a jump of 40% in debt because of COVID-19 responses, insisting on ending genocide and coloniality in our region, including in Papua and others, and insisting on coherent policies and state systems change. So even as we work with states and the work beyond, we have to do it with a deeply critical and careful eye. And the next thing I wanted to say just quickly before I end is, we really know that we need the feminist and wider progressive social movements, and governments have to be clear that this is shared work, not avoiding us, persecuting us, killing us for raising what's already clear now. And they have to know that it's not about being palatable. This is about being accurate and effective. And we don't really have the time to mince words and soften actions through civility politics. We have to be clear that part of what we have to do is accountability practice, not just for bad practice, but for inadequate and incoherent practice. And I think that means that things like when feminist groups are pushing on multiple policy processes in the state for climate emergency in Fiji, or we're in there on the discussions on oceans or community DRR relocation plans or forest and biodiversity, or we're looking at the state of water, off-grid solutions like the water reservoir states and the state of energy democracy in our country, women-led transport options, sexual and reproductive health and rights, food sovereignty, you know, including some of the things that Diva and others are doing on low-cost backyard systems and also on cooperatives. We're clear on why those matter, how they connect, and we have to insist on that political change is about system change. And I think that one of the things that we have to be clear about now is that we do this because this is the breaking time. We have to get rid of many of the old commodified development systems that didn't work before and that are further harming the work that we're trying to do moving forward.
Thanks so much, Nolene.
Thank you. Thank you. Time is very
Thanks
short.
so much, Nolene. And I think those are excellent points about breaking bad systems. Absolutely. And challenging those systems and looking at developing natural systems as well. I'm going to turn now to Tripti. And Tripti, you've heard the perspective from Nolene in Fiji. From your perspective in Asia, what good practices and experiences can you share with us that have global transformation and tackle the environmental crisis and the climate emergency from a gender perspective? Tripti, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Sandra. Thank you for giving me opportunities, and thank you to share my work, and thank you to be here with with the great panelist. Actually, I'm completely agree with this phases because it is almost the women conditions is almost same here in India. I mean everywhere. Women are the most vulnerable and most impacted by this climate change impact. And but the great part is that the women has a more strength and they are more adaptable in terms of to fighting this climate change impact, I mean, in the area of that. And I completely agree, if the local women, we have to work with them, we have to include the social, environmental and economic sectors together to address their problem. I'm just sharing with my experience. I'm working in north part of Gujarat state, located the western part of India, where it is semi-desert area, and the women's per capita income and is less than $2 per day. So they are affected with the drought, salinity, and flood kind of all the kind of climate extremes events frequently. And you know, the most vulnerables are the women and impacted are the women. But they came out of these situations and find out the local solution, which is the local irrigation system, Oumarou in their language they are calling. That is, they have not contributed in terms of the innovative this technology, but they have, I mean, own it, now they maintain it, and they are scaling up at the local level on the large scales. And trying to mitigate with these problems. I mean, so they have, I mean, to increase the cost effectiveness of this technology, we have given the water rights to the women groups, so that they have the ownership of the Oumarou, I mean, ownership of the water. We know the ownership of the land is a very poor status in India and across the globe, but by giving these water rights to the women, they are able to, I mean, share the water properly, wisely, and also they have contributed in terms of it becomes a more and more cost effective and more effective at the grassroots level. They are continuously working on it till date. So my point is that they have no, I mean, involving the women in technical innovations, which was find a very fruitful at the local level, and also very fruitful to scale it up at the large scales at the local level. And they are, I mean, contributed, still they are contributed a lot in that sense. And the women are not only, I mean, they are they have been included in the decision makings and every state of this technology. I mean, decision making to install the technology at what state, and from the that to the maintenance of that one. So they are not only tripling their income now, but also they found a dignified life. I mean, their social status has been increased because they have been involved at various stages of the participation of the technology. So the conclusion is the local people, local problem, local solutions, involve women. I mean, apart from this technology, I mean, sectors, some people say technologies and gender cannot go together, but in this example is technology and women had done a wonderful work. And we have nearly 125,000 women have benefited these solutions. And then no crop to, 3 crops now they have in a year. So this is the one examples I would like to share with you. And we are working in 12 states of India and successfully piloted Ghana, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. So it is technology which can work at the global levels. So
Tripti, that's a fantastic example. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I love that, women controlling the technology, controlling the innovation, and then controlling the water rights and making sure those are equitably shared. I think that's a fantastic example. Thank you so much. Bridget, we're going to hand over to you next. And, Tripti started to talk about this, but what do you think is the current situation of women regarding the environmental crisis and the climate emergency? And how can we find strategies to tackle the main challenges that we're facing? Over to you, Bridget, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for that. It's so wonderful to be here with so many amazing colleagues and allies in this work. And just to really build upon what Tripti said and the amazing work being done there, I think that, hopefully to those who are attending this session, there's already a clear understanding that climate change serves as a great exacerbator as opposed to any sort of great equalizer in terms of impacts. It serves to exacerbate already existing inequalities. And we are facing an existential climate emergency. I think that we can't leave this session, this Generation Equality Forum. I remember when we first started talking about the forum, there was a real push to understand that this was happening, not that climate change could be an issue on the agenda, but that this was happening in the context of a climate emergency. And, we know that countries' commitments to climate action are nowhere near what they have agreed to in terms of reaching the Paris Agreement, and the impacts that people are facing around the world, including the exacerbated impacts on women and girls in many countries and many communities, are extreme. And I think that part of the key, we focus a lot on, when thinking about the strategies of how we combat this, there's a lot of work done to showcase the examples of Tripti, for example, and the incredible work that Tripti is doing, to showcase the amazing work that we see Diva doing in community organizing, and really bringing a systems approach particularly at a community level to how we combat these challenges. And I will say that I see at a global level shifts in normative understandings of the links between women and gender and climate change and how we talk about it. The fact that the UNFCCC, the climate change negotiations, has a gender action plan. And certainly I think those are strategies to help us build understanding of what the intersections are. But I think the real strategy is the feminist analysis and feminist approach to climate justice, which is very clear on the fact that this is a systems issue, and it requires systems level solutions. So we know that since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, not 2015, was it? Yes, it's been a year. that 60 of the largest banks in the world have invested 3.8 trillion in fossil fuels. And that's just one example of the so many where we see the current system that we have is upholding and maintaining a fossil fuel-based economy, and an economy that is nowhere near any shift towards real resilience. And so when feminists, particularly under, for example, the Feminist Action for Climate Justice Coalition, are talking about what it would take to invest in social protection and a just society that's resilient to climate impacts, we're understanding that broad analysis of what it will mean to shift from and divest from harm to invest in care. And a feminist analysis of climate justice is not just about understanding the impacts that we are facing, it's also understanding the false solutions that are being proposed that we know are not dismantling any of those systems of oppression that are causing the inequalities and the inequities that we're seeing in terms of climate impacts. So I think the greatest strategy that we have as feminists is the way in which we work together to understand what are the solutions that are working at community level, highlighting them, centering grassroots and Indigenous voices, but also understanding that that's deeply linked to the violence that we're seeing against women, human rights, and environmental defenders who are calling out what kinds of solutions we need, what false solutions look like, and are demanding systemic level change to combat this problem. So I think the best strategy is the way in which we as feminists can really bridge the macro, the micro, and really understand what the systems level change we're envision, what the systems change we're asking for is. And I'm really excited my colleague Sanam is going to be speaking after this, because we've spent a lot of time this year dreaming about what our alternative future looks like. So I'll pass back over to you.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And that was absolutely great and really, really clear. We absolutely need that feminist analysis and that change in systems. It's so troubling to hear that there's still that continued investment into fossil fuels. From our perspective in Fiji, we've had 3 cyclones in less than 9 months. This is an absolute crisis. No one can rebuild, no one can move forward. Women are being deeply impacted by this. And to hear that these systems continue on, and we absolutely need to challenge this at the root cause of bad systems, as Nolene pointed out earlier. Okay, over to Sanam. Sanam, Bridget talked about the current situation and strategies. Could you please talk deeply about the role of different stakeholders like civil society, young feminists, governments, and the private sector in addressing the environmental crisis and the climate emergency?
As deeply as I can in 3 minutes, but thank you so much, because Noeline and Bridget have already gone with my theme of systems change already. To your question, Sandra, the key word here is emergency. The Beijing platform already in 1995 said awareness of resource depletion, degradation of natural systems, and dangers of polluting substances has increased in the past decade, and that was about the 90s. And rising sea levels as a result of global warming cause a grave and immediate threat to the people living in island countries and coastal areas. So that was a red flag 26 years ago for us to find those in-between stages of low carbon, natural gas instead of diesel and coal and so on, but with the path to ending our use of fossil fuels. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report made it clear that we need to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius, not 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. So the IPCC was sounding an alarm. In an emergency, everybody must act. We cannot dance with this idea of low carbon in between levels anymore. We need to see a rapid shutdown of the fossil fuel industry and a well-planned, just and equitable transition to a renewable energy industry that is community-centered, not just building dams and displacing communities for the sake of so-called development. In the Action Coalition context, I would want to see 6-month, 1-year, and 2-year plans to end fossil fuel extraction and use. You might be thinking, am I asking for too much? But let me tell you what I know from my country, Bangladesh, which last year in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis was 1/3 underwater. Each year, the annual floods take away more and more lands. And as my sisters from the Pacific have said and know very well, aside from this, we have regular cyclones disrupting our lives and forcing us to rebuild again, and again. Each year, rising sea levels erode more coastal area land, And increased salinity makes it impossible for us to continue to grow rice and other crops, as well as increasing blood pressure levels and the chance of having a miscarriage for women. Bangladeshi people are migrating over and over from the coast to mainland, from rural towns to the city, and then crossing from borders and finding jobs as construction workers and cleaners and taxi drivers and domestic workers in the Gulf, in middle-income countries such as Malaysia, and in the global north. And when they're there, they're termed economic migrants, as if they had a choice, as if their traditional livelihoods are waiting for them, as if there's anything left. That kind of reality was presented in COP15 in 2009, and we didn't have any binding outcome. Even the Paris Agreement remains voluntary. So what I'm trying to say here is the climate emergency is a multifaceted problem of public health, of migration, of the economy, and not just a few environmental indicators that you report on under SDG 13 or only consider after the COVID-19 pandemic is over. Imagine our human reliance on fossil fuels as a substance abuse problem. We know it is killing us and we need to quit it. Every stakeholder has a role. Governments need to stop silent climate and labor and migration and women's rights discussions at intergovernmental forums such as COP or at CSW. Civil society and young feminists need to keep fighting for the best possible outcomes in policy areas. And for the private sector, I think we really need to distinguish between the known multinational actors who have created climate denial and the rest. And I can only appeal to stop this misinformation, because when you continue to insist that coal, oil, and gas is not so bad, my people continue to lose everything. And it is not fair that my government has to struggle to find ways to bring energy to 160 million people and meet its commitments to sustainable development, and is only given the option of signing deals for offshore gas exploration or a coal station in the midst of the Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest in the world, or for first world countries to even suggest nuclear power as an option when we know the massive dangers of nuclear energy and wastes from Chernobyl to Fukushima to the leaking dome in the Marshall Islands. A small country like mine and other small island development states need the private sector and global north of governments to open up the options for clean energy through investment, through subsidies, to expand on successful projects such as solar panels in southern Bangladesh that operates on peer-to-peer sharing of energy, not on profit. Small businesses and startups that are trying to bring life to the renewable energy sector need the subsidies and support and that wind beneath their wings. So those are just a few key highlights of some of the ways that the different stakeholders can work together and some of the real emergency actions that we need to see. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Sanam. That was excellent. You know, raising those red flags 26 years ago and us having to continually lobby and advocate, you know, to continue to raise them and being ignored by private sector, ignored by governments, and seeing the impact, the real impact on people's lives. You know, it can be somewhat disheartening, but I think what's been fantastic about this panel is some of the solutions that are being brought to the panel discussion. So I'm going to also turn to Bhumika. Bhumika, I know that you are also looking at financing solutions, so it'd be great to hear from you. You know, Sanam discussed her experience, and I want you to think about, from your economic experience, can you talk about the linkages between economy and the environmental crisis and climate emergency? Over to you, Bhumika.
Hi, yes, thanks. I hope you can hear me. I am so honored to be on this fantastic panel. Everyone's already talked about many of the key issues. And I want to just clarify that where I come from as an advocate is really about systems change and about structural transformation of global economic governance and the international economic order at large. So we look at the climate emergency, which is bound to escalate in the coming future and already happening. And we see that there is urgent action to decarbonize society. Bridget already talked about the intersectional inequalities that are being exacerbated on every scale and dimension. And I just want to highlight not just economic, social, and gender, but also race, caste, sexuality, disability, and occupation. And that to say the genesis of our climate crisis is historically situated in a colonial matrix of power and patriarchy. And this colonial matrix has situated fossil fuel-based global industrialization and financialization paradigms with origins in the North. So first and foremost, climate debt is at the center of international economic architecture reform. So when climate justice activists say that an equitable, gender just, and rights-based economic response to the climate crisis has to be at the center, we're really talking about the structural transformation of global economic governance. The key position here is that reforming the inequitable global economy requires a redress of perpetual and cyclical debt crises, corporate tax evasion, and fiscal and monetary policies that are structurally biased toward austerity. And this is at the heart of, really ensuring that a strong, rights-based, public sector centered economy can steer and scale up the kind of public financing, not private investment, but public financing for public services, goods, and systems that are urgently required. For example, in climate change loss and damage and its resulting humanitarian and ecological disasters, the most critical support system will be a robust public health, care economy, education, and social protection systems. So when communities are hit by disaster, it's not private investment and hard infrastructure and airports, roads, and bridges. It's strong public systems and social infrastructure in green spaces, in water and sanitation systems, in care economy that is quality, dignified, decent work, employment in care economy and in our health and education systems. This is what will provide redress, protection, support, and healing and transformation. But this public expenditure and investment is going to be virtually impossible if public revenue in developing countries is going into debt payments, is being constrained by fiscal austerity measures, or is being lost at vast scales to corporate tax evasion and other illicit financial outflows. So today we see in the midst of an ongoing pandemic and economic recession in the South, the World Bank estimates an additional 200 million people will fall into extreme poverty. And we see that many developing countries are already allocating more of their national revenue to debt servicing than to their critical domestic health and economic needs. In total, governments of developing countries have transferred to their foreign creditors, and in particular, private creditors, big banks, investment funds that refuse to participate in debt restructuring, approximately $194 billion in 2020, which is 4 times more resources than all of International Monetary Fund emergency financing so far. So this is why economic justice advocates, as well as climate justice advocates and feminist justice advocates, see a clear through line of structural economic transformation, where debt cancellation is at the very center, as well as a systematic debt workout mechanism under the auspices of the UN that is fair, that is transparent, and that is binding to concretely restructure the debt crisis. So I'll leave with that to just show that public sectors are at the center of a feminist climate response. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhumika. That was excellent. That the figures that you were sharing with us are absolutely shocking. The amount that's being paid into debt repayment that could be invested into social services and structures and systems, health, education, water, green spaces, and decent work that could get economies going in a much more, sustainable and equitable manner. And just how do we convince governments and those institutions to move in that direction? So this is one of our, big challenges. I'm going to move on to Aisha. Aisha, given the prevalence of the double crisis in climate change and COVID-19, what can we learn from young female climate activists? What's been the experience in the Caribbean? Over to you, Aisha.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you to UN Women and everybody who is behind this. I see this as an excellent opportunity to not just share, but to learn. And certainly I have been learning a lot since the start of this conversation. Climate change for us, and it has already been suggested by some of the speakers, for us, it's something that we live every day. And so our activism is tied up in our very existence on a daily basis in the Caribbean. The climate is part and parcel of who we are. It shapes our daily activities. And so, you know, if it rains too heavily, or we have some kind of climate-induced storm, you know, of a particular category, then schools are closed for an extended period of time. You know, if we have an extended drought, then women and children and animals are without water. So it's not something that we have to try very hard to understand. It's very much, you know, caught up and tied up with who we are. And if we trace back to the antecedents or the historical antecedents of our climate experience, we as young feminists and activists in the region are very much aware of the ways in which colonialism has shaped our current realities, recognizing that, you know, our lands were raped, for want of a better term, to place us in this position of vulnerability where we are. And so our experience and I think our key lesson in tying that to COVID would be one that allows us to recognize not just the immediate impacts of, say, the COVID experience, but the long-term impacts of that compounded by the climate crisis. One of the things that we have been ardently doing as activists and as women in the region is to stay present, is to keep the conversation of climate change on the table along with the COVID conversation. And I can speak to Jamaica's experience more specifically, because there for us, COVID has unearthed some very depressing realities for us you know, who have been in this work and in this space. It's not new, but the extent of it is certainly jarring. You know, when initially we had lockdowns and curfews, we recognized that women and children were the primary ones going hungry. When we had work from home situations, which we still have in some cases, recognize that the burden of care for you know, and that the extent domestic violence and gender-based violence at home and the impacts on women again. And so these are things that we spoke to about the potential impacts of climate change in terms of the extent to which it's happening right now. And it was not readily understood. And I think certainly COVID has laid that bare in a way that, you know, nothing else could have. And so our challenge now to everyone in this space is to recognize the extent to which women have regressed as a result of the pandemic, and consider the long-term effects of the complicated, complex climate crisis, and how much further, you know, women are going to be taken back in terms of the progress made and that reduced. Recognizing again that women, because they make lower incomes, because they are more dependent on external sources for funding support, because they had larger households, are completely, you know, just take again their spending capacity, their liquidity is completely undermined by the pandemic. And again, in several countries across the Caribbean, we've had different events, climate events take place that, you know, again, compound the issue. I would say for us as young feminists and activists, though, the message and the lesson I would put to the rest of the world is one of resilience, because in the face of all of that, we have continued to activate, to mobilize, to vocalize, you know, to stay present. And we are calling on our governments and calling on global governments to ensure that the lessons from the pandemic are integrated into all actions going forward. As we prepare for COP26, for example, you know, we're talking about the main issues and the priority issues for the region: loss and damage adaptation, climate finance, and the importance of, you know, we confuse the terms a lot: gender sensitive, gender responsive, of ensuring that it's not just taglines and tag phrases, but doing this in a meaningful way, recognizing the implications at hand for women and girls if this is not done properly, and society at large. And so our ask, like I said, in going forward, is to ensure that our governments this transformative approach to leadership, that this idea of patriarchal approaches to leadership that are, profit oriented. We're asking for people oriented leadership, for leadership based on empathy, for leadership that is centered in kindness, for leadership that recognizes that all of us have a stake and all of us, have a hand in this process of healing, and in a way that allows men and women equity. And I know that it's far-fetched in a lot of ways, but it's still something that we're putting out there because that's our position as young feminists and activists.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Fantastic. And I think that your point about staying present and staying active and continuing to hold your leaders accountable, and your description of how COVID-19 has really exacerbated the existing inequalities. I think we've all experienced that all around the world. And that is absolutely true. And the impacts of colonialism across the world, and already starting from an unequal space where your land has been raped, and then having to move forward from that, and then hitting COVID and these unequal systems as well. These are multiple and intersectional challenges that feminists are facing. We've got a couple of questions, and I want to raise one for the panel. We've got a few that have been put online. So if the panelists can raise their hands, whoever wants to take on the answer. We've got one that's asking, do feminist organizations and feminist individuals in your countries work in coalition with environmental-based political parties, such as the Green Party? Does anybody want to answer that one? Any hands up to answer that? We can contemplate it. Okay, go ahead, Sanam.
Just to briefly say that in my country, we're basically a one-party state. We don't have much choice in terms of political parties, and neither of the major political parties have any environmental policy, even though the government does raise the point in intergovernmental spaces about being one of the countries that is having to deal with the reality of climate, whereas they're not the ones that have caused, they're not one of the historical polluters. And I know that the Green Party from the UK has taken a serious interest in some of the issues in affected countries such as Bangladesh and in the Pacific, and they've visited, we've spoken with the Green Party, but I should remind that there isn't a Green Party in every country.
That's right. Thank you, Sanam. Not all of us have democratic systems that we're working with. Absolutely.
I could come in just really
we'll move
quickly
on to the second round of questions.
Sorry.
And I'll go again. We'll start with a question to Tripti. Tripti, how do you see the environmental crisis and the emerging strategies? What are the emerging strategies that must be taken to reverse the course?
Oh, the environmental crisis is not a very new thing. I mean, it happens from the years and years, and the local peoples are always finding their solutions at the local level. The problem is that there are so many micro level solutions that exist, but the micro level and macro level has a great gap. I'm thanks to these women engaged for common futures organizations like Vido, who had taken who had taken up our innovations at the global level, and we are able to reach to the many affected areas. But everyone is not at that what luck. So every local problems are still become a local, and micro level efforts are going on and on. So more investment, more resources, more efforts need to be done to bridge this gap between the macro and micro level efforts. And I'm sure that there are so many local solutions are available and which can solve these problems, and with a gender perspectives. If it's, I'm completely agree with the Bridget that if a feminist approach to the climate justice is the most appropriate solutions for these ones. So do the more investment, put the more efforts, finding out and research it out the more local solutions, and scale it up at the global level. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you so much. I love that answer, where you've got micro solutions, locally driven innovations and solutions, and getting the investment into that so that you can scale them up at the macro level. Thank you. I think that's a great response. I'm going to turn now to Bridget. Bridget, what would be your recommendations to comply with what was established in the Beijing platform in the GEF with the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice? And what are some of the linkages with the work of the UNFCCC? Over to you.
Can you hear me? I just want to double check.
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. Yeah, I think that one of the things I'd love for folks to take away from this is that a huge part of why I think we as feminists, and because we tackle this question a lot, why would we as feminists engage in a space like the UN climate change negotiations, which are not a feminist space? And I think that it's important to understand these global policy spaces are not what we would call areas for top-down change, because that's not where change comes from, but they are spaces to build movement and spaces to build power. And I think that our key strategy here is building a deeply connected ecosystem as advocates and as feminists. So even as Trupti said, we've had the privilege to work with Trupti and many others through a program called the Gender Just Climate Solutions, which is a program collectively run by the Women and Gender constituency, a host of advocates from many different countries who are bringing their own national and local level experiences of climate solutions, of challenges, of challenging false solutions, and coming together in spaces like the UN climate change negotiations to build collective agendas, collective feminist analysis and agendas. And to do that kind of cross-collaborative learning, cross-stakeholder learning. And one of the things that we often find is our fights are very similar. The solutions being put upon us are very similar in terms of the challenges that we have from them. And once we're able to really bring our analysis collectively together, we've seen strides in being more powerful in pushing for change. So I think that where we push for compliance, where we're able to, through something like the Action Coalition for Feminist Action for Climate Justice, is that we're able to create an action space and an action area for further ecosystem building and further movement building, so that feminists such as Noeline, Sanam, Trupti, Bhumika, Aisha, who are just some of my most profound mentors in my life because of the work that they do, are centered in what climate action looks like and are bringing a very strong, deeply connected feminist analysis in part of a transnational feminist movement, I would say, to really reframe what climate action and climate justice looks like, and hold anybody who's claiming to work on behalf of gender equality to account, particularly if they're a developed country, for example, or a private sector entity that's furthering our reliance on the extractive industries, on fossil fuels, on the military industrial complex, or on the carceral state in general. I think that it really helps that when we're deeply connected to be able to call out inaction and to call out false solutions and a false claim to gender championship, essentially.
Excellent. Thank you, Bridget. I mean, it absolutely highlights the power of coalitions and the power of working together and taking action and coming up, using coalitions to build that analysis and be able to hold systems and institutions accountable. I think that was an excellent statement. I'm going to move on now to Sanam. Sanam, as a former chair of Beijing and the Civil Society Steering Committee for Asia Pacific, what would be your recommendations to comply with what was established in the Beijing platform in the GEF and the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice?
Thanks, Sandra. Well, as a former chair of that committee, I also just want to share that in 2019, we're only able to bring together 300 civil society delegates for a region that represents more than 60% of the world population, and more than 900 people applied. We in the region are really desperate for that regional space because, as mentioned earlier, we're struggling with democracy in many of our spaces, like Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean has been carved up by colonial powers, saddled with debt by Bretton Woods institutions, and then just left to it. And we see that struggle for democracy in many contexts, particularly right now in Myanmar. I think we can link that, for example, to the fossil fuel point, because the military that's running this coup right now and blatantly is shooting people, including children, on the streets, they're the ones that were selling mining rights and other kinds of extractive, lucrative deals. And this is what many of these countries are sitting and waiting for. You know, Russia was so blatant as to send their defense minister to the armed forces parade last week. So, you know, this is another aspect of climate justice that we need to think about, which is militarism. So really coming back to, you know, what we need here is, my first recommendation is to give people's movements a space and listen to them instead of cutting them off and telling them to compromise. It's not us who have to compromise when human rights defenders are giving up their lives for us and sitting in prisons. It's the extractive and fossil fuel industry. It's the military industrial complex. These cannot exist anymore. This is the moment to find ways to shut down fossil fuels, to innovate, not just in renewable energy, but to create the jobs in the areas of recycling and waste processing, to address microplastics in the ocean and limit the use of deadly pesticides. These are all feminist issues. And secondly, while this may sound insultingly obvious, I would say, you know, the Action Coalition and all other gender equality advocates just really need to read the Beijing Platform for Action and implement the actions outlined. There are clear recommendations and actions for the government, local authorities, NGOs, private sector, and other stakeholders. It's very specific and translatable to policy, ranging from education of women in STEM, development of gender-sensitive databases, monitoring and information systems, conduct of environment and gender impact assessments, integration of women, including Indigenous women, in decision-making, research, and policy. Take, for example, Action 256F, which is promote the knowledge and sponsor research on the role of women, particularly rural and Indigenous women, in food gathering and production, soil conservation, irrigation, watershed management, sanitation, coastal areas, marine resource management, integrated pest management, land use planning, forest conservation, community forestry, fisheries, natural disaster planning, and new and renewable sources of energy, focusing on Indigenous women's knowledge and experience. So, you know, end quote there. Since Beijing, feminist and social justice movements have used that platform as a springboard for developing more specialized agendas, such as the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and been clear about articulating the need for economic reform, mainly as a rejection of the neoliberal economic system as incompatible with human rights and economic justice. In Asia and the Pacific, we've also been clear about asking the question of who is development for, and that it needs to be rooted in justice and accountability for the people, a framework that we term development justice. So we need GEF and the Action Coalitions to take these agendas forward, from the polluter pays principles to ending illicit financial flows to reducing military spending, which is articulated in Beijing, and then to maintaining free, prior, and informed consent. The blueprints are there, from Rio to Beijing to Paris. We need everyone to make that leap forward and implement these agreements. We need to go fast, and we need to go together to a new future that is peaceful, just, equitable, without fossil fuels and militias, without billionaires and tax havens, but full of restored forests and wildlife, traditional smallholder farming, and a strong global community grounded in solidarity.
Thanks so much, Sanam. That was excellent. And I think you really highlighted the need for those global spaces, because it's true, in many of our countries, we don't have those spaces at the national level to lobby and advocate safely. And I think that's really, really critical to bear in mind. And I think too, making sure that women, in particular Indigenous women, are involved in the research and industry and policy development moving forward, looking at just going, you know, reversing the systems and breaking bad systems, as Nolene put at the very beginning of the session. Absolutely. I'm going to move on to a question for Bhumika. Bhumika, according to your experience, could you please talk about the linkages between human rights and environmental crisis and the climate emergency? And why is it important not to see these topics separated?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you to my amazing colleagues for bringing out all these important contours. And just to say that everything everyone has been talking about is about a rights-based revolution. I think human rights and women's rights, economic, social rights have been used in so many contexts and in so many ways, we forget that actually it's about a revolutionary reframing to really redo the social contract, which today very much supports and facilitates and finances the private domain over and above and at the expense of the public domain. A rights-based transformation is really about undoing this systematic bias where the state oftentimes provides, too much support and incentives and priority to the private domain at the expense of its people. So we see the Beijing platform commit so clearly in paragraph 258 to undertake a structural analysis of the links between gender, environment, and development. So we see also that in terms of human rights, we know that women and children are at the center of who is disproportionately affected by climate change, ecological disaster, and devastation. And really that it's not just about impact, it's about elemental survival. It's about reproduction. It's about women working almost 2/3 of the world's working hours, producing half the world's food, earning 10% of the world's income. It's about 70% of the poorest 1 billion people being women and children. And this requires understanding gender not merely as women, not merely as female individuals, but as a coherent system that structures power relations in society, which results in women and children being 14 times more likely to die in ecological disasters than men are. So this reality demands that climate change should be viewed as an explicitly gendered lens of planetary boundaries that systematically violates economic and social rights, not merely just as an Anthropocene crisis, right? And so this is where I would like to put an urgent spotlight on two key issues with regards to women's rights, human rights. Is one, again, the erosion of public services and systems that protect human rights by fiscal austerity and debt crises. We see in the current economic crisis, as well as in past ones, that women are always the shock absorbers. And two, I want to center the social reproductive economy or the care economy, both paid and unpaid. We see again in this pandemic, as we see in every crisis, that the labor of caring for people emotionally, socially, psychologically, and materially is exactly what has upheld the world through a pandemic over the last year. And it will be exactly what will uphold societies in any crisis, especially climate. The care economy is the essential glue holding everything together. And caring work, as Bridget has pointed out, as well as climate work, is green work, is dignified work, and essential work. It is work that is currently degraded and devalued. And it needs to be completely revolutionized and upturned in our culture, in our mindsets, in our hierarchies of what is labor, what is value, what is production, so that we move care work from an invisible support system, which is also historically the greatest subsidy to the wage economy. We move it from an invisible support system to the heart of what we value, pay, support, and protect. And to conclude, work of care is also the work of protecting the land. 85% of the world's biodiversity is on indigenous land. And this is land that the indigenous and especially indigenous women are at the center of protecting and nurturing. So just to conclude, what we really need again and again is economic decolonization, a systemic reassessment of the norms and the rules that govern things like fiscal discipline, deficit financing, macroeconomic indicators. It may be technical, but in this technicality is the exercise of coloniality and what keeps our public systems and our societies bound to an ethos, a social contract that puts the private over the public. And this is at the very center of what we need to reassess, because a rights-based economy is the very anchor to rein in and redress climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhumika. That was absolutely clear. And, you know, really, you articulated this so well, how we need to absolutely overhaul and overturn the economic systems that we have, putting the care economy at the center of the economic approach in all of our countries. And you rightly said, you know, the care economy has been the one that's been holding everybody afloat. And we've seen that in COVID-19, where it's really opened up and exacerbated existing inequalities. What's sustained us? The care economy, of course, you know. And it was great to hear you talk also about revisiting the social contract. It's really critical. And I don't hear people talking about it enough these days. And it's true. That's a conversation that's incredibly important to have. I know that we've got a few questions coming on board, but I also want to give the opportunity to both Aisha and to Nolene also to come in with further reflections. So before I open the floor to more questions, I'm going to ask Aisha first to come in with some further reflections, and then I'm going to hand over to Nolene. Aisha,
Yes.
give us your reflections on the conversation so far.
So, I mean, everything, I've been taking notes because it's so amazing to be, you know, have a front row seat to a conversation like this. And certainly I say Sanam for President of the World. It's important that, you know, one of the things that you mentioned, Sanam, in terms of global spaces and the importance of, you know, a global or a body, a voice, a critical mass, and the impact that has on shaping even national policies. One of the things that we have found in our context quite often is that for as much as civil society representatives and bodies will talk at the national level, unless there is a louder voice or that amplification at the global level, there's very little action. And so one of the key recommendations that I would propose in following on that is for the need for us to continue to have these dialogues, for us to continue to create these spaces for women from other spaces, you know, small and developing states where our voices may not be as loud to shape policy, to get that support so that, you know, we can get responses from policymakers and leaders. Certainly recognizing as well that, and I will say this about the young women that I work with, we're optimistically cautious. You know, all the things that you have pointed out about just this world order, this global structure, recognizing that we are at the bottom of the totem pole in a somehow it would appear that there's this great movement of things, but it's really just on paper. I think in our minds, beyond all of the, I'm hearing an echo. Are you hearing me clearly?
There seems to be a bit of an echo.
It's a major echo. I'm not sure what's happening. All right, I don't know if you want to turn and maybe come back and see if it's...
Sorry, Aisha, maybe we'll move on to Nolene while we sort out the sound. Is that all right?
Yes, that's fine.
You want to try? Hi, it's
Nolene,
me.
I'm
Can
going
you hear
to
me?
hand over to you to give your reflections.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thanks. You know, I've been thinking a lot about stories and the ways we tell stories to ourselves and to our movements, and the ways that governments articulate their own, because there's no way that a short cycle of work by any government is ever going to change what we need to change and in the time that we need to do it. And the ways that we speak are important. So one of the things we have to think about is be very clear that things like COVID-19, it's a zoonotic disease. It jumps species. It is about the fact that it's here because of bad social, economic, and ecological practice by humans, by us. We've got 70% of the forest gone. We've got 90% of coral reefs under threat. So we're putting all of these large scale ecosystems under threat. And then we have these reactions because that's part of an integrated system. And yet we still work as if we are in non-integrated systems. Then we also do that in terms of social policies within states. So in Fiji, we know that 2 out of 3 women are affected by domestic violence. We know that we do at least double the unpaid care, domestic and communal work. And yet we still act as if every policy that we put together on climate change or economics or ecology at the international level can be easily then moved through the nation state and through our societies. So some of this is about the long, hard slog that is by all of us and that many of us are already doing. And for states to stop looking at social movements as opposition and to realize that what we are doing is the work that they cannot do. So I wanted just to say, like PNG 3 months ago, no COVID cases. Now half of all pregnant women in Port Moresby are positive. The cases tripled this month. Meanwhile, only 55,000 doses have come from Australia, and there were promised 500K doses from the COVAX global program. The rich countries are not sharing and they're not enabling the public vaccines. They're actively blocking it through things like the intellectual property waiver at the WTO. That's also a climate issue. It's an environmental issue. It's an economic issue. It's an ethics issue. It's about gender justice and human rights. So you can't say that you are progressive in one area, protect then your own interests over life and other species. And that's really what I wanted to end on. We're sitting here today, and in Papua, there's a rural area being bombed by Indonesia for gold and other minerals. And that's US and French supplied military infrastructure. So all of these things are intimately and inherently connected. So when we say we work on climate justice, we've got to be very, very clear that we're working on every other area. And the states and ourselves, we will not move until societies that are conscientized and mobilized across both state and non-state practice in non-commodified ways move these ecological initiatives, these social initiatives, and these environmental issues across the state at the very local and the very global. And we have to protect our multilateral systems right now, yes, but we will continue as feminists. This is feminists' biggest contribution, is that we know that the systemic change is what we're working on, as Bridget and others have made very clear throughout the session, and we make clear in all our work on every territory because time is short. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nolene. That was an excellent summary. I'm just going to see if Aisha is able to contribute. Aisha, have we managed the sound?
Are you hearing me? Okay, great, because I'm not hearing a feedback, right? So yeah, I was making the point that in my circles, at least, young women are fearful that this work is just for show. It's a facade. These gatherings, of privileged folks, for the most part, is just an attempt to cover all these other, inequities or inequitable practices that are being pushed behind the scenes. And so even with climate finance, for our region, we recognize that there are lots of strings attached to climate finance, and you just wonder what is at stake. What are we giving up in the name of climate finance? As we now push towards things like the just transitioning of workforces and the fossil fuel phase out, recognizing as well that small island developing states are going to be dumping grounds for old technologies, and women are going to be again, at a disadvantage in accessing newer technologies. And because of their spending these technologies and resources. Similarly with COVID, we saw that come out very strongly, where female-headed households were the ones where children were least likely to have tablets to do online learning, or remote learning. So again, just the same kind of linkages and realities between COVID and between climate, and recognizing that unless there is that attempt to ensure that climate considerations are integrated into the policies at every single level, and they are also pro-poor, right, and poor women, then we're going to see a repeat of these challenges. I welcome every opportunity to be a part of these spaces, because this is where I find hope. Because if I were to rely solely on mainstream media, what is coming out of these, male-headed institutions, then we'd feel very hopeless. And among my peers in the Caribbean, we have some of that. And so ever so often, we have to tap into these opportunities to kind of refuel, recognizing that there's so much at stake, and women continue to be victims and victors of climate change and COVID. And at any point, if we stop talking, if we stop amplifying, mobilizing, then it dies, right? And so I'm calling on, the rest of the women on this call, but more so women of the global north, like you continue to have greater access to shape these policies. And it's unfair when you come to a space in the name of solidarity, but then when you have an opportunity to shape the outcome of the process that can advance a sister's life in the global south, you do not take the opportunity to do that. And so my challenge is, wherever you get an opportunity as a woman in a more privileged position to make an impact, to open a door, because it continues to be imbalanced. And it's not just imbalanced in favor of men and women, it's imbalanced in terms of women of color, women from the global south, women from LGBTQ spaces. And so, the call is not just for the systems of patriarchy to create space for women, but for women in our spaces who have greater access and greater power and agency to continue to extend that arm. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak, because I feel as if that arm has been extended to me this evening. And I commend all of you for the work, and I look forward to continuing to challenge these positions and these institutions, because like I said, the day that we stop talking, the day that we stop working, this dies.
Excellent. Thank you, Aisha. I think those were fantastic points. I know that we're coming towards the last 10 minutes, and just, before we talk about some of the questions that have been posed on the chat, we've known for many, many years that we're in a crisis. We're in a climate emergency. We have commitments. We have Beijing plus 25. We have multiple climate commitments. We have solutions, both locally driven solutions and solutions that can be scaled up. We have innovation. We know we need to break bad systems, and we know that, the climate crisis is intersectional, that it impacts on our health, our reproductive health, and it impacts in terms of the intersection between violence and militarism. We know that part of the solutions include keeping social movements moving and making sure that coalitions are supported and strong. And we know that we need a total overhaul of our economic systems, from a private to a social care economy. We also know that we need, when we do have access to those conversations and systems, that we need to make sure to open that access to others that don't have access, as Aisha just pointed out. So these are some of the big takeaways from the discussion so far today. I wanted to open up to the chat. I think some of these questions have been asked online already, or answered online already. One of them is from Carolina. The question is, the ecofeminism movement and climate change solutions, are these based on gender equality, or are they the same thing? Does anyone want to answer that question?
I think Bhumika gave a good answer in the chat. Do you want to just share what you wrote, Bhumika?
Please, I can't see it.
Yes, I thought this was a really great question, because ecofeminism has such a long history, and it's upheld in a very compelling and forceful way, which is wonderful. But way I would put it, the way I see it is that the difference between ecofeminist movements and climate justice movements, which have many, many intersections, is that feminist equality, rights and justice may be mutual, but climate justice prioritizes systemic solutions to economic, social, climate, energy policies, and so on. Not just policies, but the policy norms, the mindsets, the institutional frameworks, the power relations. And ecofeminism, on the other hand, has prioritized the role of women as environmental stewards, the role of women in being the leaders and the knowledge holders of caring and nurturing for the environment, and in being the leading solution makers. Now, if we truly integrate both ecofeminism and climate justice, and I would say climate justice does integrate this, what we can get is ecofeminist climate justice, which would be a really powerful framework for systemic change that is rooted in women as knowledge holders and knowledge producers.
Thank you, Bhumika. That was an excellent answer. I see you also answered Kyra's question about commercial tourist mega projects. Maybe you want to just summarize your answer for everyone.
And that one, to be honest, I'm laughing because I was just dreaming. When I travel and I go to there's these ridiculous, enclaves for tourists that are so deeply neo-colonial and so harmful to local communities. It just, that relationship needs to be so dramatically reversed, where the tourists should be vetted, they should be more mindful, it should be a careful selection of who gets to experience this beauty, rather than the way it's done today, where so many of South countries are bent over backwards in providing a tourist space. So I said, can we think about how it can be redesigned, reformulated, redirected into ecologically sustainable experiences? So rather than the big fancy hotels, theme parks, villas and such, can't we redesign so that Indigenous women are at the center of these experiences, not tourist projects, mega projects, but experiences where they can lead the way to sustainably and without human footprint share the experience of their beautiful homes and lands to mindful, vetted travelers and tourists who should pay premium to experience somebody else's homes. The way we think of tourists right now, these package deals and this unmindfulness, this lack of consideration and respect, lack of humility in going to other people's homes and lands, is really atrocious. So it's a value shift that's needed, I feel. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhumika. That was excellent. Sanam, you wanted to add in?
Yeah, I also wanted to add that, I think travel opens up our minds and we always appreciate being able to connect, but we need to let communities determine how they share their space, their land, their culture, because a lot of the time these projects are being forced onto them and they don't get to decide which part, like which temple of theirs gets to be a tourist attraction or not. And that is not fair. If something is supposed to be your own and it is your community and you don't want it to be colonized, because that is what we are doing to our Indigenous communities, even, within countries that are of, like I come from I am a brown person, but I am a majority race in my country in Bangladesh, and my majority race oppresses the Indigenous minority there. And right now, the government of my country is handing over a project for a new Marriott hotel in Indigenous land and displacing Indigenous communities. So it's not just, you can't argue with the Merle people in Bangladesh that, oh, you're going to get a nice job in a hotel, it'll be good income, when you're destroying their livelihoods. It's also about consent. And that's why earlier I spoke about continuous free prior and informed consent. And I also wanted to highlight this necklace that I'm wearing, which is made by a wonderful and brave Indigenous women's rights defender from the Philippines in Cordillera, also the most militarized zone in the world. And that is also an example of how she chose to craft something and share it, rather than me going in and appropriating Indigenous culture. And that becomes a way of us, always operationalizing consent in every interaction that we have.
Thank you, Sanam. That was excellent. Aisha.
Yes, thank you. If I may, just say that of course in the Caribbean, COVID has again just completely made clear the unsustainability of our tourism industry. And again, giving us food for thought and reason to pause and reflect on what do we do with an industry that sustains and provides so much GDP for so many of the islands in the Caribbean, but is clearly very much vulnerable to climate impacts. And if what we're seeing as a result of COVID is anything to gauge what we can anticipate coming off the back of climate change, then certainly it means that we need to, really do a re-engineering there. And in the same context, I'll say that we have seen that women are largely the ones displaced from this industry, because a lot of the low-skilled workers are women who make up this industry. And so again, female-headed households in that sector being plunged into even greater poverty. And it'll be interesting to see how our governments deal with that, and particularly going into the COP. I know a lot of the conversation is around re-equipping people in some of these industries, but again, in a lot of instances, the re-equipping initiatives will target men. And so even with our NDCs and all of the policies, again, just calling all the women who will be involved in these negotiation processes and spaces to ensure that women are very much at the center of all of these processes.
Thank you, Aisha. I know that we're being given a countdown to sum up. Okay. I'm just looking at some of the further questions and answers, and I know Aisha, probably Nolene, you'd want to also respond to that, certainly in the experience in Fiji and the Pacific, and the shutdown and the tourism industry sustaining the economy here has, really, really revealed the vulnerability of Pacific small island states. Maybe Nolene, you want to add to that?
Yes, just quickly, I'd say one of the things you have to think
Nolene,
about.
I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I think they've put me on mute. Has our system been put on mute?
I can hear you. Nolene.
I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. All right. So in Fiji, for instance, we have 150,000 people underemployed or unemployed out of work, out of a population of around 850,000 people. So when you have that large scale set of change that occurs, then there are all kinds of consequences. And one of the things that we have to think, I think, in terms of tourism is everything that we do, all the travel we make, personal is political. So for those of us who've made mistakes in the past as states, and with unsustainable tourism, I think we're getting a really big wake-up call. But I think much more deeper than that, one of the things is that those who are marginalized and at risk, including women, but specifically LGBTQI people, sex workers, women in informal settlements, women in rural and maritime communities are being affected much, much more than ever before. And what we're seeing is a huge number of people who are moving back into villages and settlements who already have
I think we've lost
infrastructure issues. Yeah.
I think we're being...
It's okay. It's all right. It's okay.
We've been musiced out.
Sandra,
I don't know if you can still hear me.
Yeah, you can just turn
I want
English.
to thank you so much for your participation in the panel discussion. Absolutely has been fascinating, and all of your inputs have been fantastic. We've learned so much from each other. I just wanted to say that one of the questions in the chat was about composting the patriarchy, and I don't think we should do that because it'll poison the compost. Okay, I think we're being cut off. So thank you so much, fantastic panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you.